After the last video editor I looked at, I needed a break. I needed something that was actually going to be good. And today, because a lot of people keep telling me that it's actually a really good editor, we're having a look at Shotcut. Now, I'm gonna spoil something. I don't love it, but I can definitely see why a lot of people were telling me to use this editor. It is by no means perfect, but I think with a bit of extra work from the developers, this could actually be a really amazing video editor and could probably replace Kdenlive for a lot of people. Being an MLT-based video editor, when it comes to the performance problems, the same ones that exist in Kdenlive exist here as well, where it's not exactly using threading properly, but you do get a really big advantage by being MLT-based, and that is with all of the things that come with the library, mainly in the form of things like effects. So I think a good way to look at something like Shotcut is basically as Kdenlive Lite. While it might look similar to Kdenlive also being Qt based, it is by no means a clone of Kdenlive, and it exists on its own merits. So first up, let's actually have a look at how adding effects is actually handled. So one thing you may have noticed is when I didn't have a clip selected, this box right here wasn't actually populated with any data. And now that I have selected a clip, there's no way to actually go and unselect a clip. The only thing I can go and do is select a different clip. So the effects in this application are listed under the filters. So in here, none of the effects are actually going to be listed until we actually go and add an effect to the clip. So in this case, it's called Add a Filter. If we click on that button, it's going to show us a big list of all the things that are actually available. These are broken down into video, audio, and also our favorites. I didn't actually go and favorite these myself. These are just the favorites that are built into the application. So if you've ever used Kdenlive, all of these effects are gonna seem very, very similar. Let's go and add an effect. Now, one thing I did notice is this is the one video editor out there where the transform isn't actually named a transform. If you want to add a transform, what it's actually called is size, position, and rotate, which from a descriptive sense does make far more sense, but if you're used to the other name, it is kind of annoying to deal with. Anyway, let's go and add this one. And as we can see, it lists out all of the properties that we can go and change. Everything you'd expect to have here from a transform is going to be here, and we can actually go and save presets as well. So let's say I want to put this at that size, and we want to go and change the rotation here. If I go and click on the plus here, that's actually going to let us name a preset. We'll call it video preset. And let's go and add an effect to another one. So this one here, let's add the size, position, and rotate on that one. And as we'll see under the presets, we should have another one in here. There's a bunch of others that are there by default. Right here we have the video preset, and that does the exact same thing to that clip that we had to the other one. But we can also go and keyframe the effects as well. Now, one thing this does, which I don't know why a video editor would ever be missing, is it separates out the keyframes from the rest of the timeline. And not only does that, it also syncs the playhead between the two different timelines, so if you are trying to work out exactly where you want to place a keyframe, it's very easy to do. And what we see in the keyframe box isn't the keyframes for the entire timeline, it's just the keyframes for the clip we have selected. So right now, the only keyframes we can actually see are the ones for this clip right here. If I go and click on this clip, now it shows the keyframes for this one. If I click on this one here, now there are no keyframes. Now we can go and modify all of the effects at once, but it's a bit finicky to work out what exactly is going to change. So right now I have this preset enabled right here. If I go and grab this dot here, it's actually going to change when we switch into that actual setting. So right now it should be rotating, but in this case it's not. It was rotating in the test I did off camera. I would recommend, if you're going to be keyframing stuff, go and keyframe it individually. Now, a pretty annoying problem with the keyframes is when you undo, keyframe changes are going to be ignored. Everything regarding effects, even adding effects, is going to be completely ignored. So if you make any major mistakes when setting your effects, it's going to be easier just to go and delete the effect and go and re-add it. I don't like when video editors do this, and usually it's not supposed to be like that. It's just a bug they haven't fixed yet. I hope it does get fixed though. To actually start adding keyframes for an effect, all we need to do is click on the little keyframe icon next to the effect we want to keyframe. So in this case, I'm going to keyframe the size, and I'm going to keyframe the rotation. And as we can see down the bottom here, it actually goes and makes 2 extra timelines for us. And then to add another effect, all we need to do is move the playhead to where we want it to be and click on the keyframe icon next to the timeline. So let's go and add a new rotation one, and let's go and click on that one. So that actually sets us at that keyframe. We can go and set the rotation value. Or our other option is actually modifying it in the graph down the bottom here. So we can actually go and move this, and that actually changes the rotation, similar to what we saw in something like Blender. Unlike Blender though, I don't believe there's a way to lock to like moving horizontally or moving vertically. So if you do want to modify it down here, you may end up moving your keyframe, you know, out of the specific frame that it needs to be on. And another really useful function of the keyframes is this button right here. So what it's going to do is actually zoom in on the timeline so that the timeline actually fills up your entire screen. While you can go and emulate this in other video editors, if you go and click on this button right here, this will actually set when you actually start using the effect. Basically, if you want to emulate it in something else, that would be where your initial keyframe is. So before this point, it's not actually going to run the effect at all, which is kind of a nice addition, but I wouldn't ever find myself using it. Moving on from the effects, I want to talk a bit about the timeline. So I've been kind of spoiled by the way that Olive handles the timeline because everything else just seems kind of inferior. So in this case, it uses the Kdenlive style of track creation where you start with a set number of tracks, and then if you need another track, you can go and right click on any of the empty space. You can add a new audio track, add a new video track, you can remove tracks, as you sort of expect to have. So if we go and add an audio track, we can't actually put any video on here, but on a video track, you can put audio and video if it's in the same file. One thing I don't really expect to see, but it's always nice to have, is being able to grab a file from outside of the application and being able to just drag it directly onto the timeline without first having to drag it into the playlist. So we can go and take this and just drop it anywhere in here, and it works exactly the same as dragging it from inside of the application. As you may have expected there, if you drag a track onto another track, it automatically does overwrites. I prefer it when a video editor has this as an option, but it isn't the default. I like it the way that Kdenlive does it, where normally what's going to happen is if you drag it onto something else, it just stops the dragging. Now, a pretty big problem I have with this is the way that group handling is done. So we can do group selection, which is always good to see. If we go and press Control, we can click multiple files, works perfectly fine. We can even do things like press Control A, and that selects every single video in the timeline. There's a problem here now. Now that we've selected everything, there's no way to unselect everything. So the only thing we can actually go and do is something like cut a video clip, wait for it to lag out, give it like maybe a minute. I think it is cutting stuff. And okay, no, that just deleted everything in the timeline. So that's a problem. There's no way to unselect stuff. I don't know why. The other problem is that is the only two ways to do a selection, selecting everything or selecting things one by one. There's no way to just go and like drag a thing and say, I want to select these 3 clips right here, which is really annoying, especially when you want to do things like, say, drag these 3 clips to a specific location. You have to go and select them one by one, and the more clips you have, the more annoying that's going to get. Now that takes us into a bit of an editing problem. So one of the problems that I have with a lot of other video editors is when I record my audio, I record my desktop and my microphone audio on separate tracks, because if I have, say, a guest on my podcast, I want to be able to, modify their volume level independent of mine in post. And for some reason, a lot of them don't let you import both of them. In the case of Shotcut, by default, it only imports the first track. However, we can get access to the second one. So what we can do is if we go and right click on the track, go to the More section, click on Detach Audio, that will then go and take out the first audio track and put it on its own separate timeline. Now what we can do is go back to the audio, click the track in here, click Audio Track 2, and now we actually have access to both the audio tracks at the same time. It is a bit annoying, but it's still better than not having it at all. Now, this is a bit of a problem. So let's say I wanted to go and do that to every single track in my timeline. Well, we could go and do it. You might think we could go and say select everything and then go do that effect. We can't actually apply group effects though, so I would have to go through one by one and do it for every single one of them, and then if I wanted to go and move the audio tracks, I would have to go and move them all one by one, because if I then went and did a selection of everything, it would move both the video tracks and the audio tracks at the same time. But at least it's a problem that can be fixed. Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier is that when you go and delete a clip, let's say this one right here, for example, by default, it's going to be done through ripple deletion, which some people don't exactly like. Ripple deletion is basically when you delete a clip and then clips after it move in to fill its space. By default, it won't be rippling across every single timeline. To go and ripple like that, we go and click this one right here, and then if I go and delete this, as we can see, the clips on the other timeline also move along with what's being deleted. If you want to do ripple deletion, I think that's probably the better way to do it, just to make sure that if you have separated audio and video, they still stay in sync. Moving on to the audio, one of the things this application does really exceptionally well is the way that it handles waveforms. Look at these waveforms. These are basically perfect. I can see exactly where the dips are happening. It's not cutting out at some arbitrary point where I can still very easily hear the audio. It's going to the point where I wouldn't actually be able to audibly hear it. Unlike Olive, which seems to cut out parts of the waveform when I know there is still audio there. Also, the audio scrubbing in this application is absolutely phenomenal. It does lag out a bit sometimes, especially if you have like a slower system, but when it is scrubbing properly, it is absolutely perfect. It's almost like you're actually playing the clip. Now, moving on to the interface, one thing that kind of annoys me is no matter what you do, the grid inside of the playlist doesn't actually get resized. So no matter how much we drag this, it stays at the exact same size, and when we make it too small, you just see less of the grid. All of the rest of the stuff in here is pretty basic. It actually does sensible things, unlike Blender, where if you want to go and close a window, there is an X button here, and if we want to go and make it floating, there's a floating button here. Very simple stuff. I don't know how Blender gets it wrong. The part I wanted to mention, though, is these buttons up here. So right now, we're in editing mode, but we can actually go and switch over to something like, say, audio mode, which completely changes the interface, or the effects mode, which looks a little something like this, or the color mode. Basically, the way you're supposed to use this application is switching between these different modes depending on the sort of workflow you're going with. Now, personally, I prefer to just have one window where I have everything I need to work with, because sure, this functionality in here probably is pretty useful for someone who knows what to do with it, but for me, I do fairly basic editing, and the editing screen does everything I need it to do. Luckily, though, we're not actually limited by what each of the screens is supposed to do. So if I go and right-click on the bar up here, we can go and add things like, say, the video RGB waveform, which is that one we had on the other screen. I can then go and move this around to wherever I want it, so say, right here. And we could go and turn this completely into the color screen. We could turn the color into the editing. These are just like general sort of workspaces to separate out your work. Now, I don't usually have a ton of tracks to the point where I have a vertical scroll bar, but if you do, you don't necessarily have to go off to the right-hand side and move it with your actual mouse cursor. So if you go and scroll up and down with your mouse wheel, that scrolls horizontally along the bar. If you want to go and actually zoom in, that's done by holding down Control and using the scroll wheel. And to scroll vertically, you hold down the Alt key and can scroll up and down. Now, while the windows you add to the interface will stay the same between restarts, if we go and, move something around, like, say, make this really small, make this one down here, actually, this one here, that one like that, and make this really small, it's not actually going to save between launches, which is kind of annoying. So if I go and reload the application now, I don't like the logo. Oh, it actually did save it this time, so sometimes it saves it. I guess other times it doesn't. That actually bothers me more. I'd rather have it never work than work inconsistently. Now, even though this is an MLT-based application, the imports are really, really quick. Basically, as quick as I could ever want them to be. Having to wait, 5-10 seconds like I did there to get all of the clips for a video, that I don't really care about. Kdenlive is considerably longer. I don't know what Shotcut's doing to make this work so quickly, but I kinda like it. Now, there is one really big problem with this application. So if we go into the help menu and go to the keyboard shortcuts, you may expect this to be a list of shortcuts that we can go and modify. You'd be wrong there. So what it does is opens up the documentation inside of your web browser, and that's because you can't actually go and modify any of the keys, which right there is a pretty big problem. I've got keys that I usually work with in every other video editor, and not having them inside a Shotcut really does hurt my workflow. While you could get used to it, and if you are working with Shotcut as your first video editor, it's not actually a problem, migrating the Shotcut is much, much harder than it needs to be. And there's one other kind of annoying problem with the application. So, while it does make use of a standard MLT project file, so it looks a little something like this right here on my main screen. There we go. It looks a little something like this. It's just an XML file. There's nothing special about it. It does have a problem though, and that problem is that I can't actually go and add markers into Shotcut. So right now, my script is pretty much useless with Shotcut. Basically, if you don't know, I add markers into my video clips so that I can go and export those markers and add chapter markers inside of YouTube. I can't do that here, and that's why for any of the Shotcut videos, those were just completely missing. I'm not going to say that you shouldn't use Shotcut. I really understand why there are people who actually really like this application, but in its current state, it's got some pretty basic features that are fundamental to my workflow missing. Everything else with the application is really good. When I export files, it works basically as fast as Kdenlive, which isn't super fast, but it's fast enough. Editing stuff is fine. The keyframing is actually pretty good. Everything else is actually good. It's just those minor group problems that need to be addressed, and then I would actually consider properly using this. I'm not sure what I'll try next. I'll work it out while I'm actually editing the video. So I think that's going to be pretty much everything for me. But before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Chris, Joachim, Donald, Michael, Andre, Nathan, David Monzar, Will, Brennan, Chiku Bento, JB Joseph, Mitchell Peter D, Stephen, Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you'd like to go support my work, the links down below to my Patreon, subscribe star, Libra, all that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere, and then this channel is available on Odyssey and BitChute if you want to watch on a platform that isn't YouTube. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.